The Second World War. For 6 years, Britain faced the fight of its life. This was a total war, and it reached every corner of Britain and British life. I'm Arthur Williams, a pilot and former Royal Marine who is fascinated by the Second World War. In this series, I'm going to travel the length and breadth of Britain to discover the places and people who helped us win the war. I'll walk the paths and byways to get a different perspective and make some fascinating discoveries. I'll uncover some of Britain's finest moments, as well as some that we'd sooner forget. This time, I'm in London. Hitler believed if he could crush the capital, Britain would capitulate. But what he didn't account for was London's Blitz spirit. They cloaked the city.
It was so the Luftwaffe pilots couldn't actually see where they were aiming for.
Kept the war-torn capital moving.
They were able to rebuild and reconstruct damaged networks at great speed and keeping the buses and the tubes running.
Tunnelled deep underground.
They had a canteen down here where they served a selection of hot beverages with cakes and sausage rolls.
And even saved the zoo.
There was a gentleman that lived in Pinner and he had a lion in his garden.
During the course of the war, 12,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the capital, and they didn't just destroy buildings, they transformed London forever. On this walk, I'll travel across London to discover how the Blitz helped to galvanise the nation. My first stop is St Paul's, at the heart of the ancient city. I'll discover long-forgotten bunkers in Clapham. I'll uncover secrets of wartime propaganda in Bloomsbury. And I'll head to Regent's Park to learn how Commonwealth soldiers transformed the capital. September 1940, Hitler is losing the Battle of Britain. Try as he might, he can't defeat the RAF, so he turns to a new strategy. His plan was to bring London to its knees. Over 57 consecutive nights, German bombers pummeled the city. They destroyed more than 1 million homes and killed more than 20,000 people. The London Blitz was designed to cause death and destruction. The government was worried that Londoners would crumble. But something else happened. A sense of defiance emerged, a determination not to give in. It's what we call the Blitz spirit. Today, there are very few buildings in London as closely associated with the Blitz as St Paul's Cathedral. And that's because of this photograph. It was taken during a firebombing raid so intense, it was dubbed the Second Great Fire of London. A Daily Mail journalist ascended the rooftop of his office in the hope of capturing St Paul's final moments. But when the smoke cleared, this is in fact what he saw. Herbert Mason captured one of the most iconic images of Britain during the war, but its serenity and steadfastness hides the reality of what it was like on the ground. Over 30,000 incendiary bombs were dropped on London during the Blitz, igniting firestorms across the city. We always seem to focus on St Paul's when we think of the Blitz of London, but actually, imagine being in this area immediately around the Great Cathedral. The sky would have been thick with black toxic choking smoke, and all of these buildings would have been ablaze and could fall on you at any moment. This was the reality of the Blitz. Winston Churchill declared St Paul's must be saved. But there was a hitch. Water was in short supply. Although the Thames was nearby, it was full of unexploded bombs and surrounded by burning buildings. Volunteer firefighters risked their lives to put out the flames.
One bomb fell directly onto the dome and lodged itself, and the heat from the fire started to melt the lead that held up the whole roof. And though fire wardens did all they could to dislodge the bomb, it was in too tight, and it was feared that the entire building might be lost. But then, a piece of luck. Miraculously, the bomb dislodged itself, came crashing to the cathedral floor, and was quickly smothered with sandbags and extinguished. St. Paul's was saved.
The daring rescue of St. Paul's and the iconic images taken during the firestorm became central to the idea that London could take it. But on the ground, London was like a city under siege. People would wake up to entire streets reduced to rubble. Unexploded bombs and shattered glass blocked their paths to work. At night, air raid sirens, searchlights and anti-aircraft guns were a constant reminder of the threat from the air. From St. Paul's, I'm walking 2 miles across the city to Soho to explore another impact of the Blitz, the blackout. Soho began as a fashionable residential district in Stuart times. By the 20th century, it had become a mecca of entertainment with theatres, cinemas and pubs attracting revellers from across the capital. But the outbreak of war extinguished its famous bright lights.
In order to try and throw the Nazis off, the entire city was plunged into darkness. Now try to imagine what it would be like to walk down a street like this at night with absolutely no light whatsoever.
Blackout regulations came into force in 1939, lasting until the end of the war, and had an enormous impact on British nightlife. Soho's Café de Paris hosted big band acts during the war, and I'm meeting London tour guide Hazel Baker, who's been researching the effect of the blackout on London.
Did the authorities frown upon entertainment venues keeping the music and all the dance going throughout the raids?
When war was first declared, all of those buildings and businesses closed. However, as the war progressed, people realised that they needed to live life. And so hotels put on special events with wonderful ballrooms. Here at the Café de Paris, you'd put on your finest and come and have a dance with a pretty girl. And suddenly life kind of made sense again.
What was the idea behind the blackout?
It was so the Luftwaffe couldn't identify key landmarks. Keeping everything dark meant that then the pilots couldn't actually see where they were aiming for. We'd had a blackout in the First World War, but that was only partial. This one for World War II was on a total different level. No chink of light was allowed. So they imposed fines. People were reported to the police for showing light. It was taken very, very seriously, and people were instructed if they did use a torch to shine it at their own feet, not where they're walking. Railway stations were using a candlelight. Lampposts were cut off at the mains, so there'd be no street lights. Cars would be masked, their lights, and the gaze of the light would be downwards. So it was very, very limiting. So in order to help people out, white lines were painted on the curbs, white lines round lampposts as well. And there was also a campaign for people to wear light or carry white, which would be a newspaper or a handkerchief, in order to be more visible for their fellow pedestrians.
So in reality, what was it like to live through the blackout?
It must have been very disorientated, walking around streets that you thought were familiar, and then they're plunged into total darkness and having to feel your way around, not really being able to see anything. People tripped over curbs, over sandbags, bumped into lampposts and to each other. They couldn't really see where they were going. One woman gave up and on her way home just slept in a doorway. It wasn't the morning after until she realised that she was just round the corner from her house.
And it must have caused carnage on the streets, not just the pavements, but the roads as well, because people still had to go about their daily business.
Yeah, it was very dangerous. So 6,809 fatalities in 1940 alone.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, and that was the year that they enforced 20-mile-an-hour speed limits.
Wow.
But the blackout was not just a recipe for accidents. With half the police force away fighting the war, the cloak of darkness provided the perfect cover for criminal activity.
Billy Hill comes to mind. He was notorious. He came from Seven Dials, and he bragged in his memoirs that he didn't use the black market, he fed it. He would use his gangs and they would do smash and grab jewellery heists, often in the West End where we are now. So there's lots of organised crime, and then of course there were opportunists, and opportunists such as what was known as the Blackout Ripper. This was a man who we know murdered 4, but there may be more women victims. But one of the victims, next to her body, was a gas mask. And in there was the ID number of Gordon Cummings, an RAF pilot, supposedly happily married. And so they put 2 and 2 together. So he was tried, he was sentenced to hang in Wandsworth Prison, and he swung during an air raid.
Wow. How effective was the blackout? Because surely you can't hide an entire city the size of London.
It was very, very successful. So obviously we've got the River Thames, and the Luftwaffe came over when the moon was at its highest. However, the blackout really did help for the pilots not to identify main landmarks. But we do like to remember the positives that came out of it. However, a lot of people suffered, and I think for a lot of people, for the very first time, they saw the darkness that the city can offer.
I'm walking across London, discovering how the city dealt with relentless bombing. I've already uncovered the horrors of the Blitz and the impact of the blackouts on people's everyday lives. But despite the bombing, London has had to carry on.
One of the great marvels of London during the war was its transport network, which ran almost continuously, uninterrupted, despite everything the Nazis tried to throw at it.
The dedication of the London Transport Board and its employees won praise from around the world. Londoners knew they could wake up every morning and go to work as if nothing had happened. From Soho, I'm walking less than a mile across town to the London Transport Museum in Covent Garden. Here, you get a real sense of what was needed behind the scenes to keep London moving.
So London Transport faced huge challenges to be able to operate its network during wartime. The regularity of air raids meant that a blackout had to be imposed in London. So street lamps were extinguished, buses were actually prepared for that eventuality by having their headlights dimmed, and mudguards were painted with white paint so that civilians waiting at the bus stop could pick out the bus approaching with their torch. One of the obvious things that happened, particularly from 1940 and into 1941, was the Blitz. And one of the key things that London Transport had to contend with was trying to really, really quickly repair that bomb damage. Vernon Robertson, he was the chief mechanical engineer for London Underground during much of the Second World War. He was not a stranger to conflict, actually, because during the First World War, he'd served as an officer in the Royal Engineers and been actually heavily decorated for his bravery in being able to sort of build bridges during intense artillery fire on the Western Front in France and Belgium, and used all of that experience to be able to coordinate large teams of engineering staff to be able to rebuild and reconstruct damaged networks at great speed, and keeping the buses and the tubes running so that people could get from A to B, so that the wheels of the war effort could keep on turning.
But it wasn't just bomb damage that London Transport had to contend with. manpower and materials were in extremely short supply.
London Transport really had to kind of get with the ethos of recycling and salvage and reusing, which was a common theme of the Second World War, with resources being so short. And so it actually had to reduce the size of many of the posters that it printed, because obviously paper was in short supply. And actually even things like rubber for tyres, for bus tyres. Bus drivers were constantly reminded to drive carefully, to not go around corners too quickly, to sort of preserve their tyres and make sure that they got the maximum use out of them. Everything was on a kind of a shoestring. Maquette fabric was replaced with basic sort of wooden seating, and there was very much a kind of make, do and mend, theme to everything. A proportion of its male workforce in particular was conscripted into the armed forces, and about 19,000 women fulfilled various roles, from working as bus conductors and station staff through to actual quite hands-on manufacturing and mechanical work. And this was really, really key in making sure that London Transport could keep going during the war years.
Whilst London Transport kept the capital moving topside, below ground, its infrastructure played a key role too. Famously, the tunnels and platforms of the London Underground became makeshift bomb shelters. During the height of the Blitz in October 1940, no less than 124,000 people took shelter in the tunnels. Initially, the government tried to ban people from using the shelters, fearing some would never come out again.
After announcing that the tube would only be open to fare-paying customers, Londoners simply bought tickets and made the Underground their home for the night. And though it was considered to put soldiers at the entrances of tube stations to keep the people out, the authorities did finally give in. And henceforth, the Underground became a safe haven for countless Londoners.
But the tubes weren't the only underground shelters that Londoners flocked to. 8 new deep-level shelters were specially constructed during the height of the Blitz. And I've been lucky enough to get access to one of them. From Covent Garden, I'm heading 4 miles south of the River Thames to Clapham, where 3 of these underground shelters were built. The Clapham Common Shelter has been closed for decades and is now a relic frozen in time. But occasionally, it's open to visitors.
I know that subterranean London is a rabbit warren of bunkers, tunnels, cellars and excavations, but to actually be in one is really, really exciting, and this place is massive.
I'm meeting Julian, who's become fascinated with the Clapham Shelter's unique history.
As we sit and stand in here, it's like it hasn't been touched since the 1940s.
No, it does. It certainly smells very authentic down here as well. I mean, I suppose that's the sort of thing they can't tell from watching TV. Is just how it's kind of humid, damp, and it's it must have been quite an experience for people to be cooped up in here.
How many people would have been down here?
Well, let me see. So this is about 5 meters wide. There's 2 of these tunnels, right? So there's another one over the other side of this wall. And they're 30 meters deep, 370 meters long, which basically means it would take about 40 seconds for Christina Hurrigu to run the length of it, I reckon. And then look, you can see on the side here, it has all these holes. So there would have been beds fastened here to the wall, and there was other beds on that side all the way through, and this floor divides the tunnel into kind of a half pipe, right? So there's 2 half pipes, so it's about 2,000 in each section, and that is probably about 8,000 people taking shelter down here.
That is incredible, isn't it? What would life have been like, do you think, for the people that were crammed in here?
Well, smelly at night time, no doubt. It's probably noisy, snoring, babies crying, people arguing. But down here was a downside better than having to take shelter in the tube stations, where a lot of people sheltered. And luckily, they had a canteen down here where they served a selection of hot beverages with cakes and sausage rolls, pies, and of course, during rationing, this was quite a rarity. So it must have been quite nice in a way to have that. And also, don't forget, a public toilet as well. Going to the toilet, if you were having to shelter up in the tube stations, you'd just have to grab a bucket, check to see if the plane has passed over, wait till the coast's clear, rush out and do your business. And
Would they have had many creature comforts?
pretty much none, I would have thought. Beds were hard, functional, probably the way you like them, being in the Marines as you were.
No doubt about it.
You could make your own bunk a bit more homely and cosy, I suppose. A lot of people put like little curtains and sort of blankets around to make your own little camp down there. People could bring in photographs and things like that to make it feel a little bit more homely. People who were regulars could leave their bed covers here overnight, but a lot of people weren't.
Do you think there would have been a sense of community down here? Do you think people would have created a bond because of what they were going through together, or do you think they'd have just been tired of constantly having to crawl over one another?
Well, I think that they actually self-sufficient communities did sort of build up in these sorts of places. If you read the war diaries, people who have kept diaries when they were down here, they talk quite fondly about seeing the sort of newborn baby sitting up straight for the first time, crawling along. It wasn't always sweetness and light. The bomb shelter, even though it's massive, it still would get full up, and they'd have to close the doors, not let any more people in, and people would get desperate.
There must have been a sense of claustrophobia and panic, because you think if you're down here and you want to get out because you don't like being in confined spaces, you can't, can you? Because you stand a chance of being killed from overhead.
Oh, yeah. A lot of people refused to come down into the bomb shelters. They just said, I'll take on Jerry from up here,
Julian, what was this shelter used for after the war?
The idea was that they were going to use these tunnels, because there's two of them, they were supposed to use them as a kind of express northern line. So you've got one in Camden, Good Street, Stockwell, we're in Clapham. So it's a bit like in New York, where you can take the downtown fast train, and it doesn't stop at all the stops. But wouldn't you know it, they ran out of money. So they just remained a little bit unused for a while, and then until 1948, when the Brits sort of called out across the Commonwealth and said, we need help to come and rebuild Britain. Can anyone come and help and rebuild Britain? And of course, all these people from the West Indies said, yeah, we'll come and give you a hand. Yeah, so over they came on the Windrush. And when they arrived, they said, OK, jolly good. Where shall we sleep? And the migrants from the Windrush stayed down here in these bomb shelters. That's the reason why there's quite a large West Indian community down in Brixton and around this area.
I had no idea of that.
The other side of this wall is actually like an underground garden. So it's a company who grows vegetables under UV light. So in a place where these tunnels used to keep Londoners going, in a manner of speaking, now they keep Londoners fed. I think it's rather nice, really.
It's quite nice, actually, isn't it, when you think of it like that? I'm walking through London in search of the capital's wartime past. I've seen how London has dealt with the Blitz, but there's more to the story than just bombing. From Clapham, I'm walking back towards central London. But along the route, in Kenningsway, there's yet another clue of the capital's war.
In this part of South London, there's quite a unique legacy of the Blitz. You see these railings, well, they're not actually railings at all. They were originally stretchers designed to carry off injured Londoners away from the bombing. Their simple design meant that they were very easy to clean and could be easily mass-produced. In fact, they created 600,000 of them. But come war's end, of course, they were all surplus to requirements. And what do you do with them? Well, metal's at short supply. We've got to rebuild everywhere. So why don't we turn them into these railings that we see today? They simply sunk them into the concrete, and here they are.
As the threat of war loomed over the nation, the government feared that the imminent bombing would destroy civilian morale. To combat that fear, a relic of the First World War was re-established: the Ministry of Information. From Kenning's Way, I'm walking 3 miles across the river to Bloomsbury to visit the ministry's impressive home, Senate House. Built to house the new London University, when completed in 1937, it became the capital's first skyscraper. At 64 metres high, it was a giant of its day, but it's now dwarfed by the nearby Shard, which is almost 5 times taller. Almost as soon as Senate House was finished, the students were turfed out.
Overnight, these corridors went from being packed full of students to home for hundreds of government propagandists.
Even to this day, the decisions that were made here continue to affect how we view the Second World War. London University historian Professor Simon Elliott has been investigating the Ministry of Information's wartime history.
Simon, what was the Ministry of Information?
It was a government-devised ministry planned about a year or two before the beginning of the Second World War, and its main functions were to explain the purposes of the British nation in the war, to convey news about the war, and to maintain morale, because it was regarded as utterly vital. This is going to be a total war. It's going to be a war that involves virtually every civilian. If civilian morale drops, the war is essentially lost. So sustaining morale was quite critical. And it had to do this on a whole set of fronts. It had to organize and take photographs, publish books. It had to arrange poster campaigns. Its reach was quite extraordinary. It wasn't an ordinary ministry at all. There were civil servants, but perhaps only about a third to a half were civil servants. All the others had been recruited from outside the civil service, outside politics. So you had lots of journalists, you had publishers, you had advertising men, you had writers and literary agents, and they knew all about communication.
So at the beginning of the war, what sort of publications was the Ministry of Information producing?
It started out by assuming that it needed to exhort people to greater efforts. It really actually didn't know how to do this or what sort of tone to adopt. So it tried a number of very unsuccessful campaigns. Your courage, your fortitude will see us through, keep calm and carry on. They were extraordinarily unsuccessful. People reacted very badly. They felt they were being preached at. They felt they were being told what to do and what to think.
It seems quite ironic that 80 years on, the famous keep calm and carry on posters are probably more popular now than they were back then.
They certainly weren't popular at the time. Indeed, they were never distributed.
The ministry went back to the drawing board and quickly realised that the way to spur the country on was to give the public reliable news, and in a form they could easily digest.
It started to produce such things as the war books, the Battle of Britain being the first, produced in March and then April 1941. And their aim was to give an account of an experience people had been through, but in a detached, clear and comprehensive way. It's full of illustrations, full of graphs, full of diagrams, very impactful photographs. And the sort of information people often wanted was highly technical. They wanted to know the speed of the Spitfire fighter. What people liked was it's the sort of fact you can trust. They had to be 2 books in one. You had to have a prose account and a picture account. And ideally people would read both, but you had to have something that made sense exclusively by reading the pictures. That sold about 4 million copies in the first year.
So Simon, what's this comic here?
It's a small device, and the MI produced a lot of these, that could be distributed widely, both in this country and abroad. It didn't require any reading ability. It's a pure comic, a set of comic images dealing with Goering and Hitler. And behind it is the V for Victory campaign that emerged in 1941 and ran for a number of years in this country. And all this is simply saying is Hitler and Goering cannot escape the V for Victory. They're haunted by it. We've got to remember that comics, again, a very popular form, not just with children, but more generally, were a powerful influence on the designers and the editors in the MOI. And they produced a lot of this sort of material. So it was entertainment and information as well. And that mixture succeeds remarkably.
Senate House was also base to the ministry's Home Intelligence Department. Their job was to provide an accurate assessment of public morale. And rather than send out surveys, they went undercover on Britain's streets.
The MOI had divided the country up into 13 regions. Each region had its own regional intelligence officer who allocated jobs to people, so they'd go around listening to chats in pubs, listening to conversations and bus stops and so on, and recorded all this stuff and then sent it back to Home Intelligence, and they produced a printed report each week. And over the war, about 80 reports were issued, all sorts of things. For instance, the problems of blackout, underclothing for women and children, growing your own.
It's almost scary to think that much of the information gleaned was done by eavesdropping in pubs and things. So come the end of the war, then were the ministry happy? Had they been successful? I suppose it's something that's quite hard to gauge.
The ministry was able to produce a graph which registered the level of morale. And it really never went down, partly because the British had this staggering confidence they'd win through, they'd struggle through, they'd get through. Also the sense they had the entire empire behind them. But it's probably a combination of those factors and the work the MOI did.
During the Blitz, over 100 high-explosive bombs were dropped on the Bloomsbury area surrounding Senate House. And if you look closely enough, you can still see the scars, like on the facade of the Museum of Zoology.
Gosh, look at all this. I was told to come and look for these. You see these patch infills? Well, they're repairs that were put in the 1940s to replace bits of brick that were blown out by shrapnel damage from a bomb that was dropped in 1941. But the interesting thing is that they're much darker than the stone that they're surrounded by. And that's because they were colour matched to a building that existed in a much dirtier London back in the Second World War. It's since then been tidied up, cleaned up, and they now stand out like a sore thumb. But it gives us a real vivid indication of just how badly this building was damaged.
From Bloomsbury, I'm travelling 1.5 miles north to Regent's Park. Covering nearly 400 acres, it's one of the capital's biggest parks and was a favourite bolt hole for wartime Londoners seeking respite from the Luftwaffe's bombs. But the suffering wasn't confined solely to the people of London.
London's animal population had a pretty tough time too. Londoners' pets suffered all the same food shortages and destruction as their human owners, and some were even evacuated off to the country. But there was one group of animals in particular that caused more of a headache than most. What to do with London Zoo?
In the months leading up to the war, the zoo prepared frantically, fearing that the entire site would soon be flattened by Germany's bombers. When war broke out, the keepers sprung into action. The largest animals, including 2 giant pandas, were immediately evacuated to Whipsnade Zoo.
There were concerns that if the zoo was bombed, many of the poisonous animals would escape. And so for that reason, many of them unfortunately had to be put down. The aquarium was also drained because the fear there was that if it was accidentally hit, it might flood the local area.
The animals left behind found themselves in a very different zoo. I'm meeting James Wren to discover how London Zoo tackled the Blitz head-on.
James, how did the zoo function during the war?
We were ordered to close by the government, but that lasted for less than 2 weeks because we wanted to boost the morale of the country. As you'd expect, visitor numbers did drop, so we had to turn to advertising, and the media really helped us with some amazing positive stories. There was a gentleman that lived in Pinner, and he had a lion in his garden. It was just incredible.
You've got a lion in your garden, as you do.
But obviously with rationing, he could no longer look after that animal. So Rota, the lion, came to London Zoo, where we cared for her for a very long time, all throughout the war period, and again became that sort of unique symbol of the wartime.
How did you feed the animals?
Luckily, we grew a lot of our own produce, as we still do today. We had goats on site, so we were using goat's milk to help keep our primates happy and well fed as well. We also made an appeal to Londoners to help us with acorns to feed some of the animals here, like squirrels and monkeys, to supplement their diets. And London responded massively. We had a ton of acorns arriving every single week to help that effort. And also we ran an adoption programme to help fund the zoo during the war period, so people could adopt a dormouse or an okapi or a zebra and really support us. And that still runs to this very day.
What sort of infrastructure did you have to put around the place in order to make sure that the visitors and, of course, the wardens and staff would be safe?
So we had air raid shelters built around the whole of the zoo. They could hold 2,000 people. And then we had our East Tunnel converted into an air raid shelter.
Was the zoo ever bombed? Did it get hit?
Sadly, the zoo was hit on a number of occasions. On one particular occasion was the 27th of September 1940. There was a big strike that hit London Zoo and destroyed a number of our animal houses. It was absolutely devastating for us, but fortunately not a single animal was harmed. The worst that happened was when the keepers were doing the patrol once it was safe, they discovered a zebra had started a merry journey down to Camden, and they quickly herded it back to the zoo to make sure it was safe and well looked after.
How important do you think the zoo was for Londoners as kind of a beacon of hope in a time where, you know, all around is just consumed by war?
London Zoo would have been so important to Londoners during the war. You know, that ability to go and visit somewhere that just was very removed from their experience that they were living through at that moment in time.
What happened once the bombing had finished?
So we started to bring some of the animals back that had moved out of London Zoo during that period. So Ming the panda came back, and people just flocked to the zoo in their hundreds of thousands because they really wanted to see this amazing animal, but also to have that great day out that they've been craving for such a long time.
Great, thanks very much, Dean.
I'm walking across London to see the effect World War II had on the nation's capital. As the Blitz came to an end in 1941, Londoners breathed a hefty sigh of relief. But their peace was not to last. Just a week after D-Day, with the Nazis on the back foot, bombing started again.
But this time, it wasn't aeroplanes dropping the bombs. It was unmanned, jet-propelled flying bombs, known as the Vengeance weapons. And these things were packed with so much explosives that it said when the first one fell on the city, it could be heard 6 miles away.
At the peak of the attack, over 100 V1 rockets a day were fired at London. Soon after, the Nazis began firing larger, supersonic V2 rockets. These claimed the lives of over 2,500 Londoners.
The truly terrifying thing about the V1s was the distinctive noise made by their pulse jet engine. It was a buzzing sound. And Londoners soon learnt that when their engines cut and the sound stopped, the bomb would be only seconds from hitting the ground.
Despite these desperate final attacks on the city, victory was declared in Europe on the 8th of May 1945. More than 1 million Londoners packed the streets to celebrate.
Can you imagine the euphoria and celebration? 6 years of pent-up frustrations could finally be released. Bonfires were lit on Shaftesbury Avenue, people danced in the fountains of Trafalgar Square, and thousands congregated in Piccadilly Circus to dance and celebrate together.
Crowds flocked to Buckingham Palace and chanted for the King to come out and join the celebrations. After the war, London and Londoners would be transformed. From London Zoo, I'm walking less than a mile across the park to the London Central Mosque to learn about one of those changes. The war's impact on the makeup of the city's population. Historian Dr. Shamima Akhtar is an expert on migration and empire and has been researching the mosque's wartime origins.
Did the war have an impact on multiculturalism in London?
More than 400,000 soldiers, Muslim soldiers, fought in the British Indian Army in World War I, and this number rose to 500,000 in World War II. So there was a real sense of urgency during the war that Britain was suffering terribly. So there was a real effort and call by the British government and various businesses to get as many migrants from former British colonies or existing British colonies. And so we have individuals who are working in labouring jobs, such as chemical plants, munitions factories. There's a real kind of sense of the empire coming together to help Britain during the war.
Do we know of any notable individuals or characters that played a particularly prominent role during the war?
So we actually have an incredible story of a soldier named Noor Inayat Khan, who was essentially worked as a spy for Britain against Nazi Germany in World War II. And she infiltrated occupied France, was later betrayed and executed in Dachau concentration camp. But again, an incredible story of an Indian princess, really, who was completely integral to the British war effort.
During the war, London had the largest Muslim population in Europe, and the influx from across the empire highlighted the capital's need for somewhere appropriate where Muslims could practice their beliefs together.
In 1940, the Churchill War Cabinet approved a grant of up to £100,000 for the acquisition of a site that could be used as a mosque, and this plot was apparently intended as a tribute to the thousands of Muslim soldiers who fought in World War I and also World War II. And King George VI himself inaugurated the Islamic Cultural Centre, which we're in today in Regent's Park in November 1944.
Yeah, it's quite grand, isn't it, the dome?
Yeah, incredibly so.
Yeah, it really is beautiful. Did the war have an impact on multiculturalism in London?
Mass Muslim migration to Britain began after the Second World War due to the destruction and labour shortages caused by the war. So Muslim migrants in former British colonies, predominantly India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, were recruited in large numbers by the government and also various businesses to help rebuild the country. And they were normally employed in sectors such as transport, health services, social services and so on. So for example, thousands of doctors that were recruited in this period from India, and they played a huge role in the development of the National Health Service.
With all of this cultural change, did it have a lasting legacy on the country?
There was a real lasting legacy on Britain. So whilst there was a predominant migration from those in South Asia, so India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, there was also Muslim migrants from Yemen, from Turkey, and in lesser numbers from Nigeria, Kenya and Uganda. And as you'd imagine, we have the development of new businesses. So the need for halal food was an issue that of course impacted the sale of cattle in Britain. And so we had the development of halal butchers and again different types of clothing. And so new businesses and capitalism thereby interacted with migration to kind of create this multicultural Britain.
Thanks, Shamima.
You know, when I started this walk, I guess like many of us, I was guilty of thinking World War II, London, the Blitz. But actually, though the Blitz was devastating, it only occupied a relatively brief period of the Second World War. And in remembering this great city for just the Blitz, we kind of do an injustice to the innumerable people from a hugely diverse background that helped London survive the war. And not just survive, but transform it into the city that we know and celebrate today.